Hi, my name is Vardy. In this video, we're going to talk about 11 EQ mistakes that are hurting your mixes. But before we get started, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all upcoming videos. Number 1, start with a good source. Whether you're using a sample, a recording, or a virtual instrument, you're always better off starting with your sound source being clean. Starting with a good source, whether it's a sample, a recording itself, or if you're getting sound directly through a virtual instrument, it's always good to be able to have a good source to build up on it. If your source isn't good, trying to fix it downstream on your EQ chain, on your chain through an EQ is not necessarily the best way to do it. In some cases it can, but in most cases it's not. In this example right here, I have a bass line with 2 different layers. I'll play it for you right now. If we were to open the plugin for the low bass, let me solo it. It's in Substance. Substance is a plugin from Output. This sound itself has 3 different sounds layered on top of each other. Assuming, let's say, the volume was like this. We hear that the dirty sub is very prominent. I could simply reduce the dirty sub in the mix and get a much cleaner sound instead of EQing it downstream. Also, another example of fixing issues along the signal path is the sidechain compression I have right now that's routed to the kick. If the attack and the release are set to be super fast, then I'm going to get crackle sounds. Instead of trying to fix this with an EQ on your chain, you're better off identifying which parameter might be causing this issue. In this case, I'll just loosen up the attack and the release. And we hear that the sound is much cleaner. Number 2, you don't know your listening environment. It's always important to understand what listening environment you're in to be able to take the right decisions. If you're hearing frequencies that are too prominent because of, let's say, the room you're in, making EQ decisions based on that is not necessarily the best way to go. If you're working with headphones, it's important to note that headphones color sound in a different way. Headphone manufacturers provide a frequency response diagram for each headphone that allow you to see what's happening on the EQ curve of the headphone itself. Now, Beats headphones, for example, have their basses boosted. If you're mixing with Beats, you might tend to reduce the bass in your track, but that's not what's really going on in the mix. If you're working with monitors, monitor placement is very important as well. Aside from the placement of the monitors, acoustically treated rooms are quite important when you're dealing with mixing. The better it's treated, the more controlled the sound is and the better decisions you take. Number 3, you're mixing music too loud. When you listen to music loud, some of the frequencies, mainly in the 2 to 5,000 hertz, get dipped. So I'm just going to show you an example of what the song would sound like afterwards. So I'll turn on the EQ. I'll turn off the band. This is what the song sounds like. And if I were to put in a shelf, this is what you're hearing after a long period of time of listening to music in a loud way. And this is not a good thing for you because you're going to take wrong EQ decisions in your mix. Because you're hearing highs less, you'll tend to boost them. If you play in a band or you go to a lot of shows, it's important to keep in mind to wear earplugs because your most important piece of gear is your ears. Keep them safe. At a lower volume, you'll be able to hear fluctuations in volume of instruments clearly. You'll be able to hear transients better as well. By hearing transients better, you can EQ better and you can also use compression better. Number 4, you're making random decisions. It's easy to slap on an EQ on a track and simply decide to make changes right off the bat. Stop, take time, listen to it, and make a change with intent. And afterwards, you can A/B it to see if your decision was right. In this case, I have a bass sound with 2 different layers. I have a sub bass and a mid bass, which I'm calling bass high here, but that's fine. And if I were to simply put on a high pass to remove the low end, it'll clear up some space in my mix. And if I A/B it, it sounds much better with those sub-frequencies removed. Number 5, you don't know the functions of different EQ types. We have parametric EQs, like the EQ8 right here, which allows us to have 8 different bands. This is mainly used for surgical cuts or boosts. You can also use shelves on these as well, but the fact that you have multiple bands allows you to use it surgically. Now, if we were to, for example, decide to remove, we could easily scan through and cut whatever frequency we like. On the other hand, we have shelving EQs. Shelving EQs have less parameters, and the decisions we take on shelving EQs allow us to color the mix a bit better. Changes are made a bit more broadly and less surgically. In this case, I'm going to raise a bit of the highs in my master. Let's A/B it. As you see, it allows us to make broader changes, more musical changes to the track. Number 6, you don't know when to EQ in solo or in the mix. EQing in solo allows us to listen to the instrument by itself in isolation and remove specific elements. For example, if the recording has a bit too much resonant room frequencies, we can scan through that and remove it in the mix. Now, I'll solo the snare and I'll scan through the sound. Once I've done that, always make sure to listen to it in the mix as well to make sure it makes sense. It's always important to EQ tracks while the mix and reference. Just because a sound sounds good by itself, it does not mean that it's going to fit in the mix. So it's always good to EQ while in reference with the whole track. Just like the other way around, if a sound does not sound good, sometimes it fits the mix. What's important here is the overall song, and to keep that in mind. Number 7, you're not using your ears. It's very easy to look at the graphical features of an EQ and try to take decisions based on it. Sometimes we see EQ peaks, transients that we automatically jump on and try to reduce, but that might not be the right thing to do. Instead, rely on your ears. Decisions we make based on our ears are usually more musical. There's a plugin called Blindfold EQ, which is free to download. There's no graphical representation on the plugin, and there's no numbers identifying the knobs. So whatever change I make, I'm fully relying on my ears. Here's an example. This allows us to make much more musical decisions when we're changing parameters on the EQ. So always keep this in mind. Focus with intent with your ears and make changes without relying on the graph itself. Number 8, there's too much low end. Always make sure to clean up as much low end as possible. In this case, we have 2 bass, the low bass and the mid bass, and I've cut the low end of the sub range of the mid bass to leave room to the sub frequency of the bass on the first channel and the sub in the kick. I also have a pad here which contains a lot of sub-frequency below its fundamental, which is on about 100 Hertz. I can simply remove this. This will leave more room for my mix to breathe. So it's always important to remove the low ends wherever you can, without overdoing them. Number 9, you're overusing it. Just because a parametric EQ has 8 different bands, it doesn't mean that you should be using every single one of them. We've all seen some EQing done where a lot of bands are being cut off. Sometimes it's better off simply to do a couple of cuts to be able to represent that change. In this case, I have the clap in solo, and I'll activate this EQ that I mentioned before. Instead, I can maybe replace it with this one. It's much more of a natural change that we're making through this type of EQing versus the other one. Number 10, you're using too many presets. Presets can be useful because it could be a good starting point. It could also lead us to creativity at the same time if we're working with presets and virtual instruments. In this case, I have my snare, which I've soloed. And this is an EQ called Enhanced EQ from Native Instruments Bundle. And if initially, this is what it sounds like. And if I were to put in a snare preset, I realize that it's sizzling a bit too much. So it's a starting point, and I'm fixing it as I see it fit. I think this is much better. Sometimes a preset is made for a sound that's not exactly the same as the sound you have. It's the same instrument, but it's been recorded in a different condition, or the drum skin might be different. The way the drummer is playing might be different as well too. So use it as a starting point and build from there on. Number 11, you haven't set your levels. It's always important to first start off by setting your levels. Do a fader mix, pan your instruments, and put your instruments where they need to be in the mix, and then try to make a decision to see if you have to EQ the sound or not. Sometimes the highs of an instrument are poking out a bit. Instead of putting a shelf on it, simply reduce the volume. In some cases it works. So that's it, guys. Leave some comments and some suggestions below. We love to hear your feedback. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all new videos. Thanks. See you next time.